Major Garrett is in Washington. Major, considering the fatigue over the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, is it surprising in any way that you are now seeing candidates calling for ground troops to fight ISIS?
Well, based on my conversations with a lot of Republicans seeking the Republican presidential nomination since Paris, they really do believe everything has changed, and this is a threshold moment in which whatever reluctance they might have had or their advisors had about proposing U.S. ground forces to confront ISIS has been swept away. They no longer believe that is politically risky to do, and they also believe from a matter of military policy it's necessary to introduce that into the conversation. And if I could call a slight audible here based on the conversation you just had before the break about what NATO might do. As Chief White House correspondent for CBS, I've covered a lot of NATO meetings, and there's been this great question raised by NATO nations since the end of the Cold War. What is NATO's mission? What is it really involved in? NATO has been useful in Afghanistan and assisting U.S. forces there. It has played a nominal role in the air war against ISIS in Iraq and Syria. But this very well may be the next great mission for the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. All those nations that aligned to confront the Soviet Union and ultimately prevail in the Cold War, they may now want to organize themselves militarily and from an intelligence perspective to fight ISIS. And what you see in these Republican conversations that are gaining momentum about U.S. forces working in collaboration with other regional nations is part and parcel a discussion about not only re-energizing America's military confrontation against ISIS, but possibly bringing in NATO and possibly creating another alliance with sympathetic nations in the Middle East who now see this as a threat not just to their interests, but to global interests. So this may be where this debate is going, driven in part by the conversation you're seeing on the Republican presidential campaign trail.
That was going to be my question, Major. That might be the discussion on the campaign trail, but will that make its way to the White House? How likely do you think that particular option might be something that will be pursued by the Obama administration?
Well, because it's being talked about in a Republican presidential context matters. But if it were only happening there, it would matter less. But it's not. The European nations are talking about this in completely different ways than they were before the atrocities on Friday in Paris. There is a conversation, as the expert we had on before the break talked about, a passenger name recognition system in Europe. The French are now pushing for that. That's a database on anyone who gets on an airplane anywhere in Europe. That has to go before the European Union. That idea was pushed after the Charlie Hebdo terrorist attacks and was pressed down. The European Union wasn't comfortable about having or managing that kind of a database. Thoughts about that are now completely different after the Paris terrorist attack. So all of this conversation is evolving. And what you're hearing from Republicans being more willing to place larger numbers of U.S. ground forces inside Iraq and Syria to confront ISIS is paralleling a conversation about more intelligence and a more robust military action and posture on the part of European nations who now see this threat in starkly different terms. Even after Charlie Hebdo, which was stark and terrifying enough, this has now taken it to a completely different level.
Before we let you go, Major, despite the attacks, France is going ahead with plans to accept 30,000 Syrian refugees. What kind of message does that send to the U.S.?
It sends a message to those in the United States who are very skeptical, in some cases downright fearful about bringing in more Syrian refugees, that a nation that was just attacked, that is going through all the heartache, the horror, and the trauma of those attacks on Friday, is still willing, with a vetting system, to bring in refugees who are displaced, dispossessed, and in the greatest need of humanitarian assistance. That signals to the United States that the country that was attacked, the proximate victim of the ISIS atrocities, is still willing to open up its arms to those who need the help most. That may reframe the debate here in America, but I will tell you, based on conversations with lots of Republicans, they believe the politics of this moment are such that caution and resistance to more refugees is the place to stay, at least for now. That may evolve as this debate goes forward.
All right, Major Garrett for us in Washington, D.C., thank you.